This is Just Right. Sweet Haven Farm Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 3. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 6. Chapter 8. She had volunteered to man the dunking booth. In December. What kind of fiendish town had a dunking booth at their Christmas celebration? One that was really twisted, if the long, long line of people at her booth was any indication. Avery sat, shivering, on the end of the plank. So far, the first 3 patrons who had put quarters in the slot, 8 quarters for 1 ball, so at least they weren't going cheap, had not been able to throw the ball with enough force to push in the lever that dropped the plank, which would dunk her into the water. One little boy had hit the lever, but it hadn't been enough to drop her. It was just a matter of time. She wasn't even wet, and she was shivering. Had the mayor done this on purpose? She knew the town thought her odd because of the cat carrier, and possibly the tuba too, and maybe because she planted corn with full makeup and inch-long nails. Possibly because she hung out with Jillian, who was regarded with just as much suspicion. Probably, though, she had ended up perched on the plank because she was new to town and as gullible as a 2-year-old being offered candy. The town probably thought her parents had kept her in a cage. It wasn't really true, but she had been cooped up in her room most of her high school years practicing the tuba. Mediocrity didn't land a woman a chair in a prestigious orchestra. Even at 15, she had known that. But now, at 27, she hadn't enough street smarts to know when she was being bamboozled by a small-town mayor. He'd acted all innocent about it, and if she recalled correctly, hadn't even asked her outright, just goaded her into offering by making her feel bad about the poor town and their great need for help, and insulting her intelligence by hinting that she couldn't make change. The man was good. They could at least heat the water. "Why aren't you wearing a bikini?" the teenaged boy who was next in line asked. Because she thought she was going to be picking up rings from bottles and handing out teddy bears with pretty red Christmas ribbons on them. Not to mention, it was only 40 degrees out. She'd have worn a wetsuit if she'd have known, and if she'd had one. But hey, she could be a good sport. Plus, she needed to distract him. He was the first one who looked like he had the brawn to get enough power under the ball to push the lever in. "Your mother is bringing me hers." The kid behind him guffawed and smacked him on the shoulder just as he threw the ball. It went wide. Avery breathed a sigh of relief. Only 2 hours and 55 minutes of this torture left. It was not going to get better. Avery pulled her legs up to her chest and held her cold toes in her hand. Surely this was illegal. The next kid in line started to put his quarters in. "Hold up." Avery jerked her head up as her heart sank. Gator. He had the power to slam the lever in. His aim was probably dead on, too. "Aw, man, it's my turn," the kid whined. "You'll get your turn, bud. I'm going out on the board." "You are?" Avery gasped. "Unless you have some kind of weird cold water fetish." "I don't," she said immediately. He grinned. "Didn't think so." She let go of her legs. He nodded to his side. "You'll have to hold my dogs." Her eyes went to the animals sitting calmly at his side. "You can just tell them to stay. They listen pretty good." Gator shrugged and started to turn away. No, he couldn't leave. Gator," she called out. "Yeah?" He glanced over his shoulder. Where are you going? I wanted to help you out, but I can't let my dogs roam wild. Someone told me it was illegal. Plus, I've also heard that the dog catcher is a real jerk. Avery wilted on the board. The cold water inches from her feet mocked her. She lifted her head as Gator started to walk away again. Okay, I'll hold them. He turned. One corner of his mouth lifted. You don't have to. I just wanted to see if you would. You mean you're not coming up here? Stay, he said to the dogs. He ducked under the rope and walked around the side of the tank. I am. Hop down. She licked her dry lips as he dropped his jeans, revealing a black wetsuit. You really are helping me. I figured you didn't have a wetsuit. No. It's what everyone does. Doesn't keep you warm exactly, but it helps. I'll keep that in mind for next year. They probably won't ask you next year. Typically, they get a newcomer to town. Newbies will do anything to fit in, and trust me, the town takes advantage of that big time. I'd kind of forgotten that the night the mayor came in the office. The man's good, I'll give him that. I see. But usually they have enough time to get themselves a suit. I knew last night you didn't. I've got one she can borrow. It's in the attic at your mother's house, honey. Kristen stood at the edge of the rope. Gator stiffened at the sound of her voice. Slide back, Avery. I'll help you down. Don't get off. You're not even wet. Kristen held a ball in her hand. Avery hadn't seen her put quarters in, not to mention she'd cut in line. She scooted back faster, hoping she didn't end up with splinters in her butt. Splinters in her butt was preferable to being submerged in ice water. If they were going to make people be in a dunking booth in December, they really should give them a nicer place to sit. Sliding her feet around behind her, Avery reached for the rungs with cold toes that felt more like blocks of wood than her normal, supple appendages. She had no idea how she'd ever get herself down the ladder. What if she'd actually been dunked? When her tongue was no longer frozen to the roof of her mouth, she'd have to ask if anyone had ever died at the dunking booth. She was guessing not, but one could never be certain. Maybe the mayor was also the town lawyer. Strong fingers gripped her foot and guided it to the ladder, holding it steady as she backed down. Her knees shook so hard she wasn't sure she would stay on. She held the sides of the ladder as tightly as her frozen fingers would allow. Large hands gripped her waist, pulling, and she let go with relief, allowing Gator to ease her body down his. His big arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her into his warmth, although she was shaking so hard he had to press to hold her against him. You stay there and warm her up. I'll sit on the plank for a while. Kristen brushed past them, saying something about a wimp, and climbed the ladder. Avery watched, a little stunned. She turned her head up and asked against Gator's chin, She has a wetsuit on? Is there something about this whole Christmas celebration that I've missed? Nah, she's probably doing the lumberjack competition. You need a wetsuit for that? Not really, but there is a part where you walk across logs on the water. You can still win if you fall in, but even with all the exercise, you get cold. He ran his hands up and down her arms. He probably thought she was a huge baby, shivering and cold, too much of a wimp to sit on that plank any longer. She supposed she should have insisted on sitting there until hell froze over, which wasn't going to take long. And, of course, it had to be Kristen that showed her up. Hard to figure it was anything but purposeful. You warming up? Gator's voice, soft and low and right beside her ear, caused her to shiver. Guess not, he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice.
I'm better. I'm kicking myself for not being stronger.
She eyed his dogs as they came around the tank, but at Gator's command they stopped and lay down a few feet off. I'm not an expert, but I think one of the things that men like about women is that every once in a while we get to rescue them. It makes us feel manly and needed. Avery stood still, his arms around her. Was he insulting Kristen?
Are you saying I make you feel manly and needed?
The idea that a tough guy like Gator would need her to make him feel good would make her laugh if her teeth weren't chattering so hard. But after a few seconds of silence, his answer was low and sincere. Yeah. Her entire body heated with the warm, comfortable, and unfamiliar feeling of being taken care of. She loved the idea that she was making him feel good, too. After a moment of that, though, the modern woman in her bristled at the implication.
You like it when women are bumbling and incompetent because it makes you feel like a jock?
She felt, more than heard, him sigh, like she'd let him down. Maybe she'd jumped to the easy conclusion. After all, she liked it when Gator looked at her like she was good enough to eat, but she didn't want to be regarded as a sex object. That didn't really make sense. She could hardly expect him to be totally reasonable when, Lord knew, she wasn't. A shout and a splash interrupted her musings. To her shame, knowing how cold the water was, she grinned anyway, bigly. Gator's voice contained a smile when he whispered in her ear, "Sounds like Kristen got wet." She snuggled deeper in his arms. Her mind might say that she needed to be strong, but the rest of her was enjoying every second of having this man's solid arms around her, taking care of her.
That should have been me,
she sighed. The dogs lifted their heads at the noise, but didn't get up. It was going to be me. She volunteered. He paused. I might have to donate a few dollars to the cause.
Is that passive-aggressive behavior towards your ex?
Nope, it's pure aggressive, not pretending anything else.
You two have a complicated relationship.
Water splashed behind them as Kristen got out of the water. Not really. We don't have a relationship at all. This is the first I've seen her in years.
Does she have family in town?
The dogs didn't look as ferocious when they were sleeping. Avery relaxed even more into Gator's heat. No, unless you count my mother, but Kristen never really warmed up to her.
I don't get that. Your mother is the nicest person I know.
Gator's arms around her had warmed her up enough that her teeth had stopped chattering. Kristen is pretty focused on getting what she wants and isn't too interested in people.
But you married her anyway.
We were pretty much the same, but I think I might have grown up some, and she just got greedier. That's my side of the story anyway. Maybe she has a different one. Gator's shoulders moved against hers in a shrug.
So you have no idea why she's in town?
I'm guessing she wants something. I don't have any idea what it could be, and I'm not interested in finding out. Was hoping if I avoid her, she'll have to leave before she corners me long enough to tell me. Avery snorted.
I see. You're not a little curious.
No. She shut her mouth. Talking too much was a fault she'd been working hard on overcoming. That and prying into other people's lives, both of which she was doing just now.
Thanks for rescuing me.
Thanks for needing rescued. The dimple beside his lip appeared as his lips turned up, and she couldn't help but grin back. She still couldn't believe that the man needed reassurance that he was strong and capable. It was odd to think of men, as insecure, but maybe that had something to do with the men she knew running off with younger women. They needed that reassurance that they were still desirable or something. But that only confirmed her decision that she shouldn't have anything to do with Gator. After all, if he were constantly looking for reassurance, he'd be leaving with another woman before she knew it. She stepped away and his hand slid off her shoulders.
I think I'll go get your mom and walk around with her, if you've got a handle on the dunking booth.
She's here. That's why I was a little late rescuing you.
Oh?
I left her with Jillian. Mom is pretty well respected in town, and I thought Jillian and she got along well.
Avery tilted her head and narrowed her eyes. Gator had seen that Jillian wasn't considered normal by the townspeople and had dropped his mother off to help Jillian integrate. She could hardly believe that's what he was saying. But as she met his gaze, she had no trouble reading his expression. He knew Jillian didn't fit in, and he knew his mother could help her.
Close your mouth, Avery. She slapped her mouth shut. Gator glanced back at the dunking booth where a wet, shivering Kristen sat on the dunking board. I'd better go relieve Kristen.
If you think your mom is okay, I'll stand and keep the unruly hordes in line.
She eyed his dogs, then gathered up her nerve.
And I'll watch your dogs, too. Keep them from leaving you for the little people.
He laughed and they split up, him to the back of the tank, she to the front where a small boy wearing a Santa hat had just put 8 quarters in the slot. Kristen didn't hesitate to climb down, and Gator sat on the board in his wetsuit. Avery took a moment to admire him. It emphasized his broad shoulders and narrow waist, and defined his muscular arms and legs. Stepping back to give the miniature Santa room to throw, Avery checked the time. 2 hours until the booth closed.
Have you and Gator known each other long?
Kristen's voice came over Avery's shoulder as the little boy threw his ball. It missed, she noted with satisfaction, dropping in the chute and rolling to the cue with all the other balls.
No.
She smiled at Kristen. No reason not to, just because they were different.
I think they were selling hot chocolate with cinnamon sticks over by the courthouse if you need to warm up.
Kristen's lips were blue around the corners, although she wasn't shivering, possibly because she had her jaw clenched.
I saw coffee down the block.
Kristen waved her hand.
Coffee works too.
Avery smiled at the next person in line, another little boy. A few teenaged girls had gathered at the end, and she figured seeing Gator is what had drawn them to the booth.
I thought it was kind of weird that he took your place up there.
She nodded to the dunking booth.
And I thought it was really odd that you let him.
That was not a veiled insult, Avery told herself.
Why wouldn't I? You don't want a man, any man, to think that you can't do something. It makes the entire gender of women look weak.
Kristen shook out her towel and rubbed it over her hair. Avery kept her smile firmly in place, even if the gratitude she'd felt toward Kristen had been misplaced, seeing how Kristen had only been trying to keep her gender from looking weak.
I didn't have a wetsuit. Even if I did, I had no desire to get dunked into a tank of cold water. Seems to me I'd have been stupid to turn him, or you, down. Well, I gave our gender a good showing, at least. Kristen ran a hand through her short, dark hair. Avery shrugged, not really caring. It wasn't a competition between men and women, at least not to her. Although, as Kristen walked away,
Avery wondered if it kind of was. After all, she had lumped all men in the leaving for a younger, prettier woman category. Then she'd promptly quit the game. Not that she considered dating and marriage a game, but she'd quit nonetheless. The next little boy's ball went way wide, and Avery ducked under the tape to pick it up, plus a few others that had missed the chute. "Isn't Kristen sharing her suit?" Gator asked from the board.
"I'm sure she would. I never thought to ask."
"Smart girl." At that, a ball whizzed by and smacked the lever dead on. With his lips in an O and his brows raised, Gator dropped into the tank. Water splashed out the sides. He popped back up quickly, a big smile on his face. "You play baseball?" he called to the grinning teen.
"Pitcher."
Gator rolled his eyes and asked, "Can we ban people?" Avery chuckled.
"I don't think so." "It's okay. I promised my girl I'd win her a teddy bear on the bottle ring game, but I wanted to dunk this guy first."
Gator surged out of the water and onto the board. The play of his muscles fascinated Avery, and she forgot to breathe. Heat curled in her stomach. He shook the water out of his hair before he said, "I'll put a word in with the mayor that you'd like to be in the tank next year."
"You do that, mister. My mom would never let me do anything like this."
They laughed and he ran off, holding the hand of a dark-haired girl. Avery watched them go. Gator had been young and cocky once, she was sure. And she'd been young and innocent like that girl. Life had a way of robbing your cockiness and your innocence. She glanced back at Gator, who was joking with the next ball thrower, before her eyes rested on his calmly sleeping dogs. Life replaced the things it stole with other things, like wisdom, compassion, forgiveness. Maybe she needed to forgive her dad and her ex-fiancé. Maybe. It was possible that all men weren't the jerks she'd labeled them as. But backing away from that label meant opening herself up to the possibility of being hurt again. The risk wasn't worth it. One dog stretched out on its side, its head coming within inches of Avery's foot. She backed away. Chapter 9. Gator lined up for the lumberjack competition beside Kristen, facing the huge poles they'd have to climb and the temporary pools of water created exclusively for this day. They competed by twos since the course was only big enough for two at a time. He'd say she was his partner as fate would have it, but it wasn't fate. With 12 other competitors, she had either requested him or Grady Hansen, Gator's friend who was running the competition, had thought it would be funny to put them together. It was a timed competition, with the 3 judges who made sure the contestants made it to the top of the climbing pole and that their logs were chopped the whole way through and that they didn't cut any corners. But thankfully, there really wasn't any specialized knowledge that the judges needed to know. Which was good, since Mrs. Baker, who retired from the post office before Gator graduated from high school, and who was even now proudly wearing her blue ribbon for Best Christmas Cookies, which was actually a pretty big deal since the competition for the Christmas cookies was cutthroat, didn't have any particular knowledge of anything lumberjack. Neither did Larry Fontaine, who owned a computer repair shop across the street from the bakery. The third judge was Bradford Jennings, the attorney who had handled Gator's divorce. From the amused smile on his face, Gator assumed he hadn't missed the irony of Kristen and him competing together. Grady leaned down, maybe to give the table of judges some last-minute instruction, but more likely to remind them to watch the competition and not focus on the animosity between the contestants. Dr. Chandra Hamer, the family doctor whose shingle hung 2 doors down from Larry's, held the starting gun pointed in the air, waiting for Grady's signal to start. Gator scanned the crowd lining the area. The single set of portable bleachers the town owned had been set up. No other competition or booth drew such immense interest. Gator was used to the attention. In high school, he and McCoy Rodning had spent a lot of summer evenings at Fink and Ellie's pond, which had been the Brights' pond back then, practicing standing on a floating log and chopping through another one. It was the hardest skill in the competition to master. McCoy and he had gotten pretty good at it, and since they began entering, no one had ever beaten them. McCoy had gone earlier and posted a really good time. Gator hadn't seen him since he'd come back to town, and he hoped he'd get a chance to catch up later. Right now, he didn't really care about winning the competition necessarily. He only wanted to beat his ex. He supposed that made him a small, petty person. Again, he scanned the crowd. This time he saw her, standing at the end of the bleachers beside his mother, her cat strapped to her chest, his dogs at their feet, even if Avery kept his mother's chair between her and them. It was closer than she'd have been not long ago. It did something funny to his heart to see her there now. Pretty sure she wasn't standing there to see Kristen. She smiled when she saw him looking and bent down, whispering to his mother, who looked over and waved. Gator nodded, but continued looking at Avery for a moment, studying. He half expected that when she found out she'd signed up for the dunking booth that she'd have refused. He hadn't been in a huge rush to get there, and he'd been flummoxed when she was already sitting on the board. It wasn't the first time the fancy-looking woman had surprised him. That would have been when she climbed that light pole. He looked away before he allowed himself a smile. His eyes met Kristen's. She closed the short distance between them, bumping him playfully. "Ha! Usually you're pretty serious before this. You'd better quit smiling or I'll think you're happy to see me." He turned his body away, facing down the course. He couldn't think of an answer that wasn't rude or nasty, and he'd never been a trash talker. Not before a competition. Not before a divorce. And not after. "Now you're going all big silent type on me." "Where's my replacement?" If all he wanted to do was look at Avery, eating her up, surely Kristen should want to make googly eyes at her husband. He almost laughed out loud at the idea of Kristen making googly eyes. That wouldn't fit her image of a tough woman either. "He's judging the tree trimming contest and is at the meeting right now, getting the fact sheets and guidelines, since it's next." That might make it a little hard to win. It was supposed to be a blind competition, but he didn't know how closely the rules were followed. The town celebration was serious business, but they were also serious about having fun. Hard to tell which way the tree trimming would lean. He glanced over at Avery again, pulled by some invisible attraction between them. She had her eyes glued on him, absently stroking her little cat's head. Her lips turned up, but this time she didn't bend over to his mother. "Are you ready?" Grady called through the handheld loudspeaker. Gator gave a thumbs up. "Ladies and gentlemen, our last 2 contestants, Gator and Kristen Franks." Gator bit down hard on his lip to keep from smirking. Kristen had never taken his name, even when they were married. He had no idea if she'd changed it for husband number 2. "It's Pandolfino, Grady. Get it right," she yelled above the crowd. Laughter rumbled. Sorry, folks, this is an interesting pairing since Gator and Kristen used to be married. I'm sure there's no hard feelings or any extra competitiveness involved today. However, the lady has corrected me that her name is no longer Franks.
It never was, you moron. You know that.
Kristen gestured like she was going to give him the finger, but kept her hand in a fist instead. The crowd oohed. Sorry, folks, the lady corrected me again. Everyone laughed. Kristen Pandolfino and Gator Franks are the last contestants. The judges have confirmed the points of all prior contestants. Currently in the lead, we have McCoy Rodning. The crowd cheered. Contestants, take your marks. Gator adjusted his safety belt and stepped behind the line. Kristen stepped beside him.
Good luck, Gator. I hope you come in second.
He ignored Kristen. Sawdust littered the path ahead from the previous runs. Gator's old high school chemistry teacher stood on a ladder ready to dump a bucket of sawdust in front of the running fan while they climbed the telephone poles that had been set up first on the course. The sawdust obscured the climbers' vision, causing them to rely on feel to get to the top and grab the star and bag of hot dog buns that had been placed there. They'd be used for the bonfire later. The town organizers believed in frugality. Ready? Go! Grady yelled, and Dr. Hamer shot the gun with a little pop and a lot of smoke. Gator took off running. Kristen was lighter and quicker on her feet. She might beat him up the pole. He'd catch up with the parts of the course that demanded strength, the log chopping and the handsaw. They'd be even with the chainsaw. He'd beat her in the burling, spinning a log in water and balancing on top of it. On this course, they had to do it for 20 seconds without falling in. He was halfway up the pole and could see through the sawdust out of the corner of his eye that he was higher than Kristen when the image of Avery climbing that light pole the first time he met her entered his head. Avery had scooted up, somewhat clumsily, with strength born of fear. Gator grinned at the image. His concentration gone, his feet slipped and he slid about 10 feet before he caught himself. The gasp of the crowd and the silence that followed made him cringe. He'd never entered a competition and not done his best. He shoved the image of Avery out of his mind and knuckled down, climbing with a single-minded purpose. Sawdust blew past his face as he reached the top, grabbing the star and hot dog buns in his right hand. There were points off for crushing the buns, and if he recalled correctly, Mrs. Baker was quite strict about it. Wrapping his right arm around the pole, he slid as fast as he could, seeing that Kristen had already reached the bottom and had just thrown the star and rolls on the judge's table. He could see from here that her rolls were smashed. A few seconds later, his feet hit the ground and he raced to the table, taking care to set the rolls and stars down gently. Aside from the time, judging was subjective, and he couldn't help but think that he might get half a brownie point or two for being polite rather than ignominious. Kristen was already on her log, spinning it in the water when he stooped to put on the special cleats on his shoes. Over the years, as the competition had grown, the coordinators had added stations and designed accessories to accommodate the additions. The cleats were one of the additions. They didn't take long to strap on. He grabbed the hatchet and jumped. In his haste, Gator almost overshot the log, which was floating in the 4-foot-deep tank. The judges had stopwatches, but the contestants had to time the curling in their heads. Once they'd done it for 20 seconds, they used the hatchet to stop the log, then chop through it. If they underestimated the time, they were docked. It was close to impossible to stay on the log the entire time, hence the wetsuits. but this is what Gator had practiced with McCoy in Fink's Pond years ago. In all his years of doing the competition, he'd only fallen once. So when his body started to tilt, maybe confidence didn't allow him to correct as quickly as he should have. He lost more time as he pulled himself out of the cold water and climbed back up on his log. The rhythmic chopping from the other tank was a sure sign that Kristen wasn't having any of his problems. He ignored the cold and started chopping again. The scent of fresh wood filled the air. A splash indicated that Kristen had made it through her log. Despite his fall, he'd made up a little time since he was stronger and chopped through the log faster. His log broke in two a few seconds later. With the perfect balance he hadn't had earlier, he pivoted to one log and hopped out of the tank. His feet felt like cold lead blocks. Falling in the water would make the rest of the course more challenging because of the cold, but the race was still winnable. He sprinted over to where Kristen had her chainsaw running, slicing through the logs. She was slightly tentative. Other people might not be able to tell, but he knew that Kristen was afraid of the chainsaw. It was her least favorite part. Like most men, he was happier with a power tool in his hand. The fact that it was destructive and dangerous was an added bonus. He made up a few seconds with the first cut. As the circular piece of wood dropped down to the ground and he started on the second of 3 cuts, he saw a blonde head moving out of his peripheral vision. He didn't look to see if it was Avery, but the flash of blonde made him think of how her pink nails would look against the bright yellow of the chainsaw. The image of her in safety glasses gripping a chainsaw floated through his brain. She'd probably wear a stylish shirt and maybe leggings, and have that infernal cat strapped to her chest. In his head, he moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her and showing her how to hold her thumb so that if the chain snapped back it didn't break, and how to tilt the saw to get the most aggressive use of the blade width and the perfect amount of pressure to keep the saw cutting but not snagging in the wood. He could smell her sassy, sweet perfume. Beside him, Kristen dropped the last piece of wood and dropped her saw, sprinting off to the last station. Gator shook his head, trying to get the tempting images of Avery out of his brain. He never had this much trouble concentrating. He hadn't made up any time at all. In fact, he might have lost a second. By the time he finished his cut, Kristen was already up the last pole with her hatchet and had about a quarter of the pole chopped through. Grabbing his hatchet, Gator climbed easily and began chopping, taking out his frustration on his lack of focus on the pole. Whatever infatuation he had with Avery had to be overcome. He couldn't live his life daydreaming about a woman. He'd never been plagued like that before, and he certainly wasn't going to ruin his life with it now. Almost in the next breath, he wondered if she'd be disappointed that Kristen had beaten him as his ex-wife's pole top fell to the ground. She whooped and slid down the pole, smacking the bell at the bottom with her hatchet to signal to the judges to stop her time. 3 more hard chops and Gator's pole top fell. He slid down and smacked the bell himself. Immediately, his gaze found Avery. His mother had her arm around Avery's waist. Avery's smile burned up the distance between them. She clapped with abandon. Her eyes never left his. He found himself grinning at her and shrugging. He should have known she wouldn't give a flip about winning. For some reason, it didn't really bother him either. Even the fact that Kristen beat him didn't matter. "Getting slow, old man." Kristen slapped him on the shoulder, breaking the spell that had woven itself around Avery and him. He looked away from the pretty blonde standing beside his mother and over at his ex. "I guess. Congrats to you. McCoy is the only one who might have beaten you.
Kristen's hair sparkled with the remnants of the sawdust. That old lady judge always docks me points for the stupidest things. If it were just a matter of time, I'd be the winner. The judges sat with their heads together. It usually took them 5 minutes or so before they all agreed on points and deductions.
Maybe.
Gator shrugged. He wasn't going to win this year, and he supposed he should be more upset, but he just wasn't. Bending over, he picked up the pieces of cut wood. They'd be used for the bonfire where people would roast hot dogs and marshmallows and socialize until late in the night. Gator. He straightened, his arms full of wood pieces.
Yeah?
Kristen put her hands on her hips. You know I'm in town because I need to talk to you.
So you said.
He picked up more wood. Maybe if he ignored her, she'd go away. I have a proposition. As he recalled, she was the one who had asked him to marry her. In fact, he thought she'd mentioned a proposition that night, too. She said they'd be good together. What she'd failed to mention was that marriage and being good together wasn't a permanent thing for her.
Not interested.
Gator took a few steps and threw the wood into a pile. It's going to pay you. Kristen paused, then emphasized the last 2 words. Big time. He paused, just for a fraction of a second, not long enough for most people to notice, but Kristen could see a weak spot from the next hill over. Her lips pursed and she smiled knowingly. I thought money might be more meaningful to you than it used to be.
It's not.
But he thought of his mother and the medical bills. He turned to go for more wood. She grabbed his bicep. You haven't heard what I'm offering. Gator glanced over at the judges. They were still huddled behind the table. He pulled away from her grip.
You have 2 minutes. I'm gonna say no. Then I don't want to see you or hear about it again.
Relax. Your caveman persona doesn't scare me. Remember, it's Kristen, not some little blonde bimbo. His eyes shot to hers, which were narrowed and calculating. Her lips curved up in a triumphant smile. He didn't smile back, but he didn't say anything either. He couldn't acknowledge that she'd scored a point. It had been a while, but he hadn't forgotten how the game was played. Everything was a competition, and Kristen kept score. She waited a few more seconds as though waiting to see if he would acknowledge her point. After a minute, she said, The big game hunting preserve that Jace and I bought needs a manager, someone to supervise the animals, and someone to lead the hunting parties. I want you. That had been Kristen's dream, to have a hunting preserve. Part of the reason she'd married him and said they were so good together. He had the education and the skills to help her get what she wanted. He'd been lacking one thing: money. Kristen thought he'd sell the house out from under his mother to get it. She'd been mistaken.
Jace has the money, but not the skills.
It was a statement, and Kristen didn't argue with him. He laughed.
Sucks for you, doesn't it?
Shut up. Gator didn't need to be told twice. It wasn't like he wanted to be talking to her. Don't you want to know how much I'm offering? No. He'd never had a taste for trophy hunting. Meat for the table, yes. Bragging rights? It just didn't interest him. Same as teaming up with Kristen didn't interest him. If she'd ditch him after saying vows in front of a church, she wasn't the kind of woman he wanted to do business with. Not that he was bitter about the dissolution of their marriage. It was probably for the best. But he would have stuck it out,
just because he gave his word. She was the one that needed the divorce. She couldn't have Jace's money while she was married to Gator.
You forget, Gator, that we were married once.
He snorted, but he looked her in the eye. A marriage isn't something that slips a guy's mind. She rolled her eyes.
I know your mother didn't have the best insurance. I bet she's got some pretty big bills to pay. Kristen tapped him on the arm. And I know you. You're not going to let those bills go to collections. You're worrying yourself to death trying to figure out a way to pay them. Right now. You're worried. Remember, that tough guy exterior doesn't fool me.
It fools me. Let her chew on that for a while. She'd accused him of being weak plenty of times when he didn't do what she wanted. Maybe she'd wonder if he actually was faking the whole tough guy thing. He tossed the last of the wood on the pile. He didn't care what she thought. Over at the judge's table, Mrs. Baker had gathered all the papers together and was shuffling through them. Kristen's chin jutted out.
You don't have to get smart.
I'm not interested. Gator made his way over to his mother, nodding at people who complimented him or just said hi, but he didn't stop to chat. His mother, who had sat back down, was breathing a little hard, and Avery had knelt beside her and spoke softly to her with her hand on her knee. He caught the last part of what she was saying.
I can take you home if you want. No, I want to watch you and Gator trim the tree. What's the point of living if I miss all the fun stuff?
Avery glanced up at him, her brows drawn together, and her lip caught between her teeth. His eyes caught on that. A swirl of heat tightened his abs before he met her gaze. Mrs. Baker took the loudspeaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a decision for the last two contestants and a final standing to report.
The crowd cheered.
Kristen Franks won this round with 342 points.
Kristen Pandolfino, Kristen yelled, but no one paid attention.
Gator Franks had 311 points. That is good enough for third place in the contest.
The crowd cheered. Someone whistled.
And, of course, the score to beat was McCoy Rudning's 359. It stands as our winning score, with Kristen Franks in second place. Congratulations to all of our contestants. Let's give them a nice round of applause.
After the clapping stopped, Mrs. Baker reminded everyone about the bonfire, like anyone had forgotten, and then announced that the tree trimming competition would start in 30 minutes. Avery smiled but didn't say anything, as though waiting to gauge his reaction to being beaten by his ex. He looked away without giving her any clue. After all, he could hardly say that out on the course the only thing he could think of was her, that he couldn't concentrate, and he sure as heck didn't care about Kristen or whether or not she won. Let's find you a comfortable place to sit then, before it starts. Avery put a hand on his mother's shoulder.
Gator, you looked great out there.
His mother started to rise, but he scrunched down beside her, his hand on her other knee. She stroked his head, like she used to do when he was a boy.
You know it doesn't matter to me whether or not you win.
It didn't matter to me today either. His mother's eyes narrowed a fraction, and her gaze became thoughtful, but she didn't say anything.
It was hard to root against Kristen because she did sit at the dunking booth for me for a while, but I cheered with your mother.
He raised a brow and wondered if she knew Gladys had her nose on her shoe. He doubted it. I could have let you borrow my suit if your loyalty is so easily bought. She snorted.
Kristen and I both could fit into yours.
Better to have none, then.
I thought you didn't care if she beat you.
I don't, but I wouldn't want to be stuck in a wetsuit with her either. Laughter bubbled up.
I see.
Are you ready to move, Mom? Gator stood up. She nodded, and Gator placed a hand under her elbow and helped her to stand. Avery slipped an arm around her waist and said,
Jillian said she would set up a chair near our tree and put a reserved sign on it. I haven't been over to see where it is.
I saw the farm sign right in the middle of the line. There was a double line of about 20 trees. The Sweet Haven Farm sign sat right in the middle. That must be her chair, he said. He was grateful it was a low-slung lawn chair with a blanket folded neatly on the seat under the reserved sign.
Let's get you tucked in here, Mrs. Franks.
Avery lifted the blanket and the sign and bustled around, getting his mother settled. She reached up to tuck some flyaway strands of hair behind her head. I've got this, Gator said. You go take a few minutes for yourself.
I'll check on Jillian then. Be right back,
Avery said, and hurried off. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.